I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Well, wheels are coming off different places. Stacy?
Right. Well, you and I have been covering here on the Keiser Report for the last decade at least, but especially over the last 6 months as we lead up to the 50th year of fiat, when the U.S. went off the gold standard in August 15th, 1971. We've been looking at all the problems of the Triffin dilemma with, all the consequences of the exorbitant privilege. And one of the things you see is, as we've covered in Nigeria, where they've turned to Bitcoin. We've seen hyper-Bitcoinization there because they had no access to dollars during this crisis, during COVID, as world trade shut down. We're seeing a similar situation emerge in Sri Lanka, and I believe Bitcoin fixes this. Sri Lanka declares food emergency as Forex crisis worsens. Sri Lanka has declared a state of emergency over food shortages that, according to the government, are caused by hoarding, as private banks say they are running out of foreign exchange to finance imports. The move followed a sharp rise in the price of sugar, rice, onions, and other basic ingredients.
Right. Forex markets are causing food shortages. And with Bitcoin, you don't need a Forex market. That's the plain and obvious and simple truth. And country after country is beginning to realize they can escape the matrix of Forex, dominated by corrupt players who control US dollar, and they can have sovereignty, true sovereignty. If you have reliance on the US dollar, you do not have sovereignty, full stop.
This is part of what we've been covering with the Triffin dilemma, is that there's always going to be that dilemma where a fiat currency, a national currency, is the world's reserve currency, is during a time of crisis, whether it's the 2008-2009 financial crisis or the COVID pandemic and lockdowns. What happens is, obviously the elected leaders are going to allocate all their time and resources to the domestic population, and the international population therefore has no currencies with which to trade. We saw that with Nigeria. That's why they went to hyper-Bitcoinization, because there was still, their economy, by the way, didn't shut down that much because it was much younger, and they can't afford to shut down. So they had demand still for used cars in Nigeria. But there were no US dollars with which to trade with Japan or trade with China for used cars to be imported into Nigeria. So either they could have just stayed, okay, well, because we can't get dollars, we're just going to starve to death. Instead, they turned to Bitcoin. And here is a solution, I think, to Sri Lanka. Is the problem is, the government's actually having to shut down imports in order to avoid further depletion of their reserves, because they said the economy shrank by a record 3.6% in 2020 because of the pandemic. And in March last year, the government banned imports of vehicles and other items, including edible oils and turmeric, an essential spice in local cooking, in a bid to save foreign exchange. However, importers still say they have been unable to source dollars to pay for the food and medicines that they are allowed to buy. So their foreign exchange reserves have absolutely plummeted. And we'll get into that, but basically it was down to $2.8 billion in July from $7.3 billion in November.
Right, so this is part of the theme of the collapse of globalization, the collapse of dollarization, and one might argue the collapse of neoliberalism. The American model, the Washington consensus. And countries are starting to reject that full plate of foreign influence. And in places like El Salvador, they're simply going to a Bitcoin standard, and their GDP is set to double in the next couple of years.
Right, but again, the point about this story about Sri Lanka is there's demand, there's desire, they want these products. They're not allowed to have these products because in order to do so would require foreign exchange being sent overseas, because they have a shortage of dollars. So if you had a neutral currency, a neutral payments rail, whereby any demand could be met through the payments rail, despite the situation of global trade, you wouldn't have these sort of situations whereby Sri Lanka's foreign reserves, as I said, fell to 2.8 billion at the end of July from 7.5 billion. Sorry, I said 7.3 billion, but $7.5 billion in November of 2019 when the government took office, and the rupee has lost more than 20% of its value against the US dollar in that time, according to the bank. Energy Minister Udaya Gamanpila has appealed to motorists to use fuel sparingly so that the country can use its foreign exchange to buy essential medicines and vaccines.
Right. Well, who benefits from these Forex markets? It's the people who are in the money changing business, and they get an override on all that money sloshing in, sloshing out. And they get a commission, they get a rentier, globalized, financialized economy. And when it breaks down, whether through the pandemic crisis or the global financial crisis, the people who are not financiers are all going to get penalized. The financiers are not getting penalized, right? They're using this as an opportunity to even gouge more from the people. That's why the people, and we see it in El Salvador, have said, you know what? We're just going to go to a Bitcoin standard and get rid of the whole lot of you.
Well, the El Salvador experiment is ongoing. I think it's an experiment which will prove to displace, especially for developing economies. And even the Financial Times is now reporting this, that Bitcoin makes sense for a developing economy because of these issues like Forex reserves and trying to manage inflation, trying to manage the problem here in Sri Lanka is very high inflation in these staples. Of course, we at Keiser Report saw this back in 2010, 2011, after a similar situation whereby a huge amount of money printing met a financial crisis. And now we have even more money printing meeting this pandemic crisis. And the domestic economy could keep on like just printing and printing to feed the people, whereas how it filters out to the rest of the world is what ends up costing huge inflation. And then we saw in 2010 and 11 crises across the world and huge riots and governments overthrown. We'll keep an eye on what's happening in Sri Lanka, but this could just be the first of many stories to come if history rhymes with what happened in 2010 and 2011, in which we covered here. But, you know, of course, there's somebody as well that's winning, and another nation that's winning during this whole crisis, because yes, indeed, Americans are by and large getting huge quantities of stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment benefits. So for those who don't understand, like what the enhanced unemployment benefits have been, is that you get your normal unemployment benefits that everybody has. If they were made unemployed, they got their standard unemployment benefits. That was, for the past few decades, the expectation of what you would get. On top of that, they got an extra $600 a week on top of their ordinary benefits. So a lot of people were making a whole bunch more money. On top of that, they also didn't have to pay rent, and they didn't have to pay their mortgages. Millions of people didn't do that for the past 18 months. So they were flush with cash. Some people get upset in the comments saying that they deserve this and blah, blah, blah. What we're talking about is the macro consequences of that, because obviously they're staying at home, they're receiving these enhanced unemployment benefits, they're not paying rent, but they're flush with cash and they want to buy, and they spend and spend and spend on durable goods. Who's still working? We're not working here, obviously, but they are working in China. China's exports strengthen despite COVID-19 disruptions. August data shows shipments of appliances, furniture, and clothing grew, helping offset waning demand for pandemic-related goods. China's exports unexpectedly expanded at a faster clip in August, shrugging off the impact of a global resurgence of the coronavirus pandemic, port congestion, and supply bottlenecks. China's outbound shipments rose 25.6% in August from a year earlier, higher than the 19.3% increase in July, the General Administration of Customs said on Tuesday. The results also comfortably topped the 17% increase expected by economists polled by the Wall Street Journal.
Right. So the money printing in the U.S., the stimulus checks are going, for the most part, to China. And it gives them economic power.